action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, advertising and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp and I'm Giles Edwards. Today I've caught Andy Nairn. One of the world's most respected brand strategists, Andy is a founder of one of the UK's most successful agencies, Lucky Generals. Boasting a client roster including Amazon, Virgin Atlantic and Yorkshire Tea, they've been shortlisted for Campaign's Agency of the Year 5 years in a row. Bloody show-offs. Andy's book, Go Luck Yourself, reveals how chance can play its part in the creative process and how you can stack the odds in your brand's favour. Andy says, you can wish bad luck upon yourself in a good way. When you've got less money or less time, it can force you to think of something really creative. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Thank you for that. That's I'm so glad that you got to do that bit, not me. So thank you.
It's why we do it. Right, 7 quick fires. Mac or PC?
Mac.
London or New York?
London.
Dave Trott or David Abbott?
Oh my God. I started off at AMV, so I'm going to have to say David Abbott, although huge regards for Trotty as well.
Yorkshire Tea or Taylor's coffee bags?
Taylor's coffee bags I'm addicted to, yeah.
Kenny Dalglish or Henrik Larsson?
Henrik Larsson.
Oh, nice. 4-leaf clover or Lucky Rabbit Foot?
4-leaf clover.
Oh, these are too easy. Right, the last one, songs, Get Lucky or I Should Be So Lucky?
It's got to be Get Lucky, which I think, luckily for us, launched the month that we started Lucky Generals. And it looked like we'd manipulated the UK charts, I think.
I didn't know that at all. That is wonderful. You lucky, lucky bastards. Well, thank you, Andy, for joining us. Really happy to have you on. We like to, on Call to Action, celebrate routes that guests have taken in their career. So I read you stumbled into advertising after studying law at Edinburgh University. But what was your first ever job? And then what was your first proper job that led you into this land?
Well, I grew up in the middle of nowhere in a very sort of rural part of Scotland. So all my first jobs are the sort of things that you probably did in medieval times. It's like chopping thistles and weeding wild oats, which is called roguing, by the way. It's like a specific name, or like, potato picking and stuff like that. So I did loads of that sort of stuff, loads of factory jobs, summer jobs in clothes shops and, hotels and all that sort of stuff. So nothing that was remotely, sort of fodder for a CV in advertising or in the bright lights of London or anything like that. But actually, I think it was, in retrospect, quite good because that sort of work, just reminds you that there's other people and jobs and lives out there sort of thing. So it is quite grounding. And then my first proper job, as I said before, was AMV with, when David Abbott was still very much in his pomp and I was a little pipsqueak. But it was a great place to start.
But how did you? So what happened then in between the chopping thistles, etc., and David Abbott?
Yeah, it seems an unlikely trajectory. Well, I did law, sort of because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I thought that's quite a general thing to. I know that obviously there's a very specific sort of vocational thing if you want to be a lawyer, but I just thought it's quite, it'll buy me a bit of time, 4 years to work out what I did want to do, and then I quite early decided I didn't want to do law, practicing it. But I spoke to a tutor who's now a very famous person called Alexander McCall Smith, who's a great sort of one of the top selling writers in the world. And he sort of said, well, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to practice the law, but you like some of the elements of it, like putting a case together for a client, but you want to do it in a more creative environment, that was my sort of desire, then you should try this thing called advertising. And so it was a real fluke conversation, and I started applying for ad agencies and very luckily sort of got in the door at AMV. I applied as an account handler, by the way, and I think they probably took one look at me and thought, this guy is going to wreck our business and bankrupt us, but we might shove him in planning and he might sort of be all right, sort of thing.
Yeah, you use the word fluke there. Is that the same as lucky?
I guess I'm probably doing that horrible sort of false modesty, sort of pretending it was a pure fluke. Flukes, I think, are entirely based on luck. I guess what we can all do is put ourselves in lucky situations, can't we? We can just so in that case, I suppose it was a bit of a reach for me. Like I had no real right to, no connections with the world of advertising, and my degree was nothing to do with it. So it was probably a bit cheeky to sort of apply for this job that I didn't know very much about. But sometimes you got to do that, don't you? You got to put yourself in. You got to apply for the thing to get it.
You mentioned in that advice that there were parallels in terms of putting a case together, which might be relevant in ad land. What parts of law and studying law did you not like that put you off going further into that world?
Just the formulaic bits, because I think the big difference is obviously that as a lawyer, the whole point of it is, I mean, stating the obvious, is to follow rules, but to follow precedents. So if something has been proven in a previous case, then you should follow that. And you might build on it, but you're really following and applying rules. Where of course our job is much more, hopefully about breaking rules, and sort of, precedent is no use. It's the actual opposite. Yeah.
Good answer. It's almost as if you were expecting that.
Well, no, it wasn't. But do you know what? I always get the real bummer is that people, because quite a lot of people, maybe I bang on about it too much, but people will say, "Oh, you did law. What's the answer to this?" And they fail to realise that my legal experience is now like about 30 years old and based on a completely different. Scots law is actually quite different from English law, so I'm probably routinely giving really bad legal advice to people about their divorces or property causing damage wherever I go. So I should probably shut up about it, really.
No, don't, Andy. Join me. I willingly give out legal advice despite having no legal training whatsoever. I've just been in a few ugly IP scraps. That's all.
Yeah, exactly.
So that must have been amazing working alongside, if not below David Abbott. How did you find the early days there?
Yeah, I mean, I was certainly not alongside the great man himself. I was very, although he was, one of the lovely things about him, he was incredibly kind and encouraging of young people, as all were. It was a really nice culture there. It was a great place to start because they were, it was a really classical advertising training with good values. They believed in running the place properly, treating people well, and doing great advertising that really sort of treated people with respect and as intelligent people. So it wasn't like crazy rock and roll. There were other maybe potentially somewhat cooler agencies out there, but in terms of just doing really great work that was incredibly effective and long running campaigns, that was a real big thing of theirs. It was just such a brilliant place to have a formal start in the world, really.
And was your role? Did you say you got the account management role, or your role was different to the one you applied?
No, they literally, I'd never heard of planning or strategy, because you don't do, I mean, I'd barely heard of account management, but so I applied as that. And then in the interview, they said the good news, at the end, they said the good news, you've got this job, but, and they quoted it very nicely by saying, we think you'd be better doing this other thing, which I was just so happy to get the job at. I just took it, and I'm really grateful actually that they had sort of directed me in that place, because it's quite unusual. I mean, most people don't start as strategists, and I always sort of say that's not about if you start off doing something else, that you can still change later and be a great strategist. Some of the best strategists were suits or media planners or clients or all sorts of other things.
I think there's few consistencies I've spotted, and as you know, we've recorded we're just over 100 episodes now for Call to Action, and there's few consistencies to that route in that I've spotted. One tends to be that the most, I suppose, talented people that we've caught tend to take a scenic route in. Now that might be a route that includes other industries entirely. The other consistency I've noticed is that account management, or however you might call it, I know that Nick would call it client partners, whatever, but it tends to be the way in for most. And as you kind of hinted at there, maybe it's just because it's one of the few things that people have either heard of or can quite simply understand, versus the other titles like planning and strategy. But also, like you said, there's huge benefits to that because it gives you that kind of empathy and wider knowledge of the business.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I suppose, from an agency, now I see it from the different side of the coin. I guess it's easier to make a difference right out of college or right out of school as an account handler or client service, whatever you want to call it, because so you can make yourself useful. Whereas it's a little bit harder, I think, to be taken seriously as a strategist straight out the door, because I guess your clients might understandably think, well, what is this rather inexperienced person got to tell me about my my business and my brand? So I don't know how I managed to wing it for a couple of years, but maybe people were thinking about that all the way through every meeting. But I like the fact that they did stick with it and train me very quickly. It was a very sort of, they gave huge amounts of responsibility very quickly, which I think is a good lesson for all of us, accelerate people's sort of journey.
And so at what stage then, how many years in did you think that one day you wanted to start up your own shop?
It was probably maybe a decade or a bit more in. So I started working. I'd known this amazing account director at AMV called Helen Calcraft, and worked with her for a bit. And then she started her own agency up. She was, I don't think it's ungallant of me to say, she's a couple of years older than me. And then she started up a very good agency called MCBD. I was working in the States at the time, and I'd always really liked working with her back in AMV. So I, about 20 years ago, in fact, literally exactly 20 years ago, I think, I went back to, she got me back over from Goodby Silverstein in San Francisco to sort of head up planning at her startup. And I learned lots just watching her and the other partners there running a startup, because that was obviously very different from AMV and the other big agencies I'd been at. And I thought, this is great. And then eventually I was started working more really as a partner, I suppose, to Helen, rather than as a sort of as an employee. And then we hired somebody called Danny Brooke Taylor, who was great to be the sort of next generation of our, the next ECD. And so it ended up as the three of us really running the place, running this shop, which we had by this stage sort of sold to another company. But then we sort of thought, why don't we do it all together, the three of us from scratch, all, partners and equals right from the beginning. And that's really how we set up Lucky Generals.
And what's the story behind the name?
The story is absolute panic and chaos, because a couple, like all the best things in life, a couple of days before we were due to launch, we had a completely different name. It was all registered at Companies House. I still get letters addressed to this other company hounding me from HMRC, and for reasons that are too long-winded to go into, we decided we couldn't use that name. There's basically something happened in the world that meant that the name felt inappropriate, and so then we were left without. We were launching in a couple of days, literally 2 or 3 days, and we had no name. And so we had the interview with campaign booked, and we thought that's going to be a bit of a disaster. So we went to the pub and had a lot to drink, came up with some absolutely terrible names. But this one was sort of stuck with us, and we liked it. I mean, really, the truthful thing is a Napoleon quote, because somebody asked him, what do you look for in generals? He said, just bring me your lucky generals. And it was also the name of a band from Danny's youth that he wanted to be in. He wanted to create a band, and he never got around to it. So it's not quite as cool as starting your own rock band, but he's created a incorporated business instead.
So yeah, no stages to trash or hotel rooms to trash, sadly.
No, I think it's a good lesson though. You sort of, people fret about names, and of course they are really important, but it's a bit like babies, isn't it? Like you choose the name, and then you have to sort of live and grow into it. And then people will look back and either say, oh God, that was such a good name, or you could have ostensibly a great name, but if you do shit work, everyone's just going to say, oh, that's a terrible name. There's some agencies that have got terrible names, but do great work, and we don't really bat an eyelid about them.
Yeah, I made a similar point about football kits recently on a Tottenham podcast thing that I was on, and I said the same thing about our you could quite fairly find our third kit absolutely horrific and vom-inducing. But I just said, look, I don't know, if we win the Champions League, I'll love it, because that's what you then get the associated memories, right? Retrospectively, it's one of those things.
Yeah, exactly. We all sort of impose that sort of retrospective history.
And were you lucky in your early days, or was it tough? Tell us about the first few weeks and months.
It was so exciting. I really recommend it to anyone who ever gets a chance. It is mildly terrifying because we had started, we deliberately didn't want to take any existing clients or existing people. It was really just the three of us. And then actually quite early on, before we'd even started, we got offered like a really big sum of money to do some work for a sort of financial services company that would have, basically been all the first year's income on a plate without a pitch. But when we spoke to them, we didn't like their sort of way of doing business or their ethics. It seemed like a sort of bad business model. So we sort of declined that. And then had a little sort of moment of, we didn't regret that, but you does concentrate the mind thinking, right, shit, we just turned down all that money. We better make a success of this. And then the first thing that came in was Paddy Power of all things, who would not be top of our list of the sort of sector to work with, but they came in with a brief that was all about tackling homophobia in football. So we thought, okay, that's a bit different. We'll try that. We'll partner up with Stonewall, and eventually, this became the Rainbow Laces campaign that we're now doing again, but now without Paddy Power, just as a Stonewall initiative. Sort of 9 years later, and so it was a sort of and it lost us loads of money actually. So we now turned down a big account with loads of money. And to make things worse, we'd just taken on a tiny thing because they had no money. As we always joked, it was literally marketing on a shoestring because it was Rainbow Laces. And we were sort of losing money all over the place, but having fun and doing good work and, exciting stuff on an important topic. And then really things, you just got to hold your nerve when you're doing a startup. You will be judged by your first work. And so make sure it's something good. And then all the rest will hopefully fall into place, which is sort of seemed to do.
And then, given the word luck's in your name, and I know you've just sort of you've kind of explained how that name came about, and it wasn't necessarily as planned as people may assume. Why did you start writing about luck?
Well, beyond obviously there's a sort of slight bit of shameless sort of usage of a word that's associated with agency, but in a weird way, it was less to do with that, and sort of almost despite having an agency called Lucky Generals, I wrote a book about luck because I got a bit embarrassed. Honestly, I sort of thought, because as I've just explained, we didn't really put that much philosophical thought into it. Quite the opposite. And so I'd never really interrogated what is luck, how does it work. And then at the start of lockdown, I started, maybe like a lot of us, sitting at home and having some pretty miserable thoughts about, fucking hell, this is horrible and such bad luck. None of us deserve this. So I started thinking about how unlucky the whole thing it was. But then also a lot of the other big issues of the last couple of years have made me think, no, hold on a minute, you're actually really lucky in lots of other ways, and this idea of privilege has obviously become quite a big thing. For someone like me, old, white, straight, able-bodied bloke, it sort of made me think, no, actually privilege and luck touches all these big issues in society right now, good luck and bad luck. And it's a bit embarrassing. I don't understand anything about it, even though it's sort of in my agent's name. So I thought I just sort of went on a little journey of finding out about it because I was interested in it. And then the book sort of fell out of that.
How do you define luck? Because I know it's not, I think there's a few words, and maybe it's just semantics, where people can assume luck also means faith, also means, various other kind of definitions. But how do you define it?
Well, what I found is a couple of different definitions of luck. I think that there is a type of luck that is a bit like fate, where you've got no control over it. So, force of nature, force of God, or whatever it is. And then there's the others. So that's not much useful to us in business because you can't really do anything about it. There's a sort of demographic luck, which Warren Buffett calls winning the ovarian lottery. So that's what I sort of described before, where you're just by privilege, exactly, you're just born into, and that is quite useful to at least understand and recognize, because I think it's just very helpful and healthy for you to be aware of that, and that can spur you on to bigger things. And then the sort of luck that I became more interested in, because it's the sort of thing you can do more about, is the definition of where opportunity meets a prepared mind. And I can't remember I think there's various people who've claimed to have invented that definition, but I like the fact that it is about keeping your eyes open for opportunities. They might, be all in all sorts of different places, but there's still a skill and preparedness required. You got to be able to recognize the opportunity when it's shouting at you, or when opportunity is knocking on your door. You still got to be able to realize what its significance is. Because I think one of the problems with luck is that people think it's the opposite of skill and intelligence, as opposed to an accompaniment. You got to use your skill and intelligence to make use of the lucky opportunities. It's not just. I'm not telling everyone don't practice, don't learn, don't try hard. Just hope that lucky stuff comes your way, because that doesn't work. But I am saying that if you're conscious of your luck and the role of luck in life, you're going to be much more able to sort of change your chances.
Yeah, and there's things you can do to kind of better your chances of being lucky and kind of manifest luck.
Yeah, it's basically. I mean, if you think about it, luck is, and again, one of the reasons in the West that we sort of are a bit stiffy about it is that it sounds superstitious, but and unscientific. But actually, it's very mathematical. Luck is just probabilities and chance, and statistically, there are lots of things you can do to massively increase your chances of striking it lucky. So it's just shifting the statistics, I guess, in your favor.
But and like you said about us being perhaps, I think I can't remember the word you used, was it kind of a bit stiff about it? But it does seem to be a bit of a taboo term to some people, and maybe people just don't recognise it. There's a lovely quote from Nassim Taleb says, "Do not mistake dumb luck for extreme skill." But I think rather people tend to justify any means of success, I suppose retrospectively, of course, but then also skipping the part about luck. Maybe we're not, we're too proud to admit that luck plays a role in our success.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that quote to the degree which, because I think that's by using the phrase "dumb luck," then I think he's talking about the sort of the fate aspect of luck that I was talking about before. So yeah, that's not going to help you at all. But it's more about consciously trying to appreciate and change your luck. And like a lot of things in life, if you don't recognize that it exists in the first place, you're not going to be able to change it, or it's a lot harder. So the other quote that people throw at me all the time is, and again, it's got various sources. It's usually attributed to Gary Player. This sort of the harder I work, the luckier I get, which is sort of true up to a point. And as I say, I'm not here to say hard work's not important, but that is a falsehood in its as a sort of as the answer to everything. That doesn't help. Just working hard manifestly doesn't make all the difference. There's lots of people in the world who work unbelievably hard and have got very little to show for it, sort of thing. So I'm saying you do have to work hard, but there's also lots of different ways to work smarter. And so to just deny the possibility of luck is a really pointless thing, I think.
You suggest people practice being lucky every day. How can people practice being lucky? How can they best improve their odds?
Well, one way to do that, you mentioned the word manifest, and that there's quite a lot of science. Again, this is like empirically proven that if you take a moment to sort of accept and acknowledge the good luck in your life, then you are more likely to succeed. And that, I think, applies in our personal lives, but also in our working relationships. And what I noticed as I sort of went back over my sort of career through this lens, I've not really thought about it before, but I sort of realized so many of the breakthroughs have actually just been through simply acknowledging the good things within a business, not just my sort of things that I've worked on, but companies that have done great stuff. A lot of the time, it's just they took the moment to acknowledge the stuff that was sitting right under their nose, like they appreciated that they had a brilliant history, or that they had amazing data, or great people, or that they came from an amazing place. And a lot of that stuff sounds like bleeding obvious in retrospect, but quite often companies don't appreciate all of those things. And a lot of the time, I think our job in agencies is just to help companies appreciate the good stuff that's right under their noses. So that I think is one really obvious way, very practical way, is just take 5 minutes today and just think, this brand challenge that I'm working on, what is lucky about this brand? What is absolutely amazing about it? what have they got up their sleeve that nobody else has, that they just take for granted? Because all companies do that. They take stuff for granted that is sitting under their nose.
The quote I used in your intro about wishing bad luck upon yourself in a good way, is there a parallel between that comment there and the point you were making and actually the Rainbow Laces campaign that you've also touched on briefly earlier? Because I've heard you say, it was a shoestring budget, which therein lies the answer.
Yeah, well, that's it, exactly. You sometimes, very often in the field of creativity, something that looks like a terrible limit and restriction turns out to be your savior, doesn't it? You find a taboo or a flaw or a myth or something like the fact that you've got a small budget or you've got no time, and those things that look like they're really bad luck turn out to be the best thing about the brief, because it forces you to think in a different way that you wouldn't have used if you had like loads of resource or loads of sort of advantages. So, and again, I think that's a good rule in life, is that often being lucky is just about how you deal with bad luck and how you can sort of turn that. There's some kind of quick practical ways that you can sort of try and turn bad things in your life or in your work into good stuff.
Time, weather, and...
We interrupt this podcast to announce that we will never interrupt this podcast with ads. Ads that awkwardly nudge you to contact the pod's host Giles at gasp.agency. Only last week, some pod listing companies did just that, calling for guidance on research and brand positioning. But we're definitely not asking you to do that. Anyway, back to the show.
And it's probably the world's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle.
Yeah, golden shower more like. You don't want Simon Sinek, you want a proper marketing chat, don't you? Hang on.
Is there anything you do within the agency in terms of how you approach briefs then, or when you're working with brands that correlates with that advice and focusing on brands and where they may have some hidden luck?
Yeah, I think we've always done it implicitly, and as I say, I hadn't, so I can't pretend that we were doing this from day one. And then since thinking a bit more consciously about this, I've tried to encourage us all to do the things that we do on a good day anyway, but to try and do them a bit more often. So that exercise of being mindful and conscious of the good things in your client's armory is often the bit we skip over because it's obvious stuff. It's like, obviously they've got X, Y, and Z advantages, but precisely because they're obvious, that often gets skipped out, and it feels like too familiar, and isn't it too obvious and too stupid? Well, no, actually, sort of stupidly obvious stuff is often like the best stuff because it's the quickest stuff that human beings are going to find a connection with. So just making sure that people don't pass over that. And I think the other thing we just talked about there, the idea of turning bad luck. We often skip over that bit as well, where the sort of disadvantages that a company might have. We don't want to dwell on that because we want to get them to get to the bit of the briefing where they tell us what is unique about the product or what is good about it or whatever. But actually getting them to dwell on all the bad stuff can actually be really helpful, because then maybe you can turn it on its head. So yeah, we're just trying to be more conscious of it, I suppose.
The other thing, actually, I've heard you say in another interview, referencing, I think it was businesses in Silicon Valley that set up their workplaces intentionally so people mix and bump into each other, whereas in other establishments they might not. Is that something that you do yourself within your office environment?
Yeah, we're completely mixed up. Like, a lot of agencies have got, the creative floor, where you kind of need a passport to, get into. I don't know if people still do that now. That used to be the case. And I still hear sort of horror stories of that sort of, even if it's not literally true, it's sort of kind of spiritually true. But everyone's mixed up here. Everyone has to bump in each other. We don't sit people in account teams. We don't make anybody, we have an absolute policy. Nobody works 100% on the same account, because then you're in a little ghetto. So as much as we possibly can, we mix people and levels and disciplines, and also hiring diversely. That's as well as being the ethical right thing to do, it just that massively increases your chances of striking it lucky, because you're going to have different influences to bring a challenge. So yeah, it's again making it conscious. As you say, the Silicon Valley thing of that can happen by chance and by fluke and by fate and all those other words we've used. But you can engineer that to make it happen by being conscious of it and thinking more explicitly about your processes and seating layouts and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're right about there still at least spiritually being that kind of departments and walls and ghetto as you nicely put it. There's loads of examples in the book, obviously, and we're going to really promote the book and encourage people to buy Go Luck Yourself. But are there any examples you can share of brands that have been born lucky?
Born lucky. Well, we work with Virgin Atlantic, and weirdly, so maybe this is luck as well. I hadn't really thought of this, but I wrote the book obviously before we won Virgin Atlantic, so maybe this was manifesting it because I'd worked with them previously. The common thread is that they have been an amazing, obviously iconoclastic company that like to do things differently. The current line is see the world differently, and at the heart of both the work we're doing now and previously. It was a real truth that their people are amazing, which sounds like stating the bleeding obvious, but there's just something different and intangible about Virgin people and the people they attract. They don't follow a script. They're just more human, fun than conventional big airline sort of brands. So, but how do you package that? That was the hard thing. So back in the day, and this is probably more the Virgin Holidays part of the business, we had this idea of rock stars. We sort of thought that the thing that really, Virgin's roots, talk about being born lucky. I think it's always really interesting to go back to the roots of a company. And they started off as a music business, but then, started an airline, which is a pretty amazing story. And the reason probably that they've got a bit of rock and roll and a bit of swagger and a bit of not doing things conventionally is that, they'd spent the first 10, 15, 20 years of their existence hanging out with, the Sex Pistols and people like that. So we thought there was a truth that if you can cater for rock stars, then you can probably give everyone a great, customer sort of service experience. And once we got this idea of rock star service, then everything became so easy. You could hire the roadie from the Grateful Dead to give the staff, sort of training course rather than some boring HR sort of lecture. You could get a roadie in to share all the great stories about how you look after, prima donna rock stars, or you could have, we had inflatable televisions in the room that you could chuck out the window and stuff like that. I think that's an example of a company where a lot of the advantages were sort of baked into the DNA of the brand way before we ever got hold of them. And again, it's just sort of a case of dusting off that heritage and DNA and expressing it in an interesting way. Sometimes you have to invent it, but that was a case of where it was baked in.
You mentioned there, we're talking about how you can kind of improve your chances of being lucky in that structural nod to Silicon Valley businesses. You mentioned hiring diversely, and I want to give a nod and a big shout out, and maybe you can talk a bit more on Commercial Break and James Hillhouse and the team there. But something that's really important that you've done that might not get shouted about enough is you're donating the royalties for the book to Commercial Break. So for listeners who might not be familiar with them, can you explain what they do and why it's important to support them?
Yeah, they're a brilliant social enterprise which exists to increase representation amongst working class talent, based on the premise that a lot of, of all the different things that we are rightly concerned about in terms of representation, class is quite a sort of a common denominator, intersects with all the other big things like, race and, gender and all the rest of it. So their whole thing's about working class talent, and they work with candidates to make them more sellable and to sort of build their confidence and skills, and also, provide financial assistance with their quests. And they also work with companies to, increasingly, more importantly, to sort of make them welcoming places, because, the inclusion aspect is sort of almost more important than, there's no point in recruiting people diversely if you then have a very uninclusive environment. So they've done all this great work, and we'd worked with them before really successfully, thought they were amazing. And so I liked the idea of a book about luck, bringing luck to other people. And I guess this year alone, we've handed over a check for over 10 grand. And then we've had lots of donations in kind, because other people have said, oh, well, I can donate lots of training. So about £20,000 worth of training. Somebody started off an apprenticeship off the back of it. That was 30 grand. So it's, it's not the biggest sums of money in the, given the scale of the challenge, but that every penny of that makes a difference to someone who's, who just needs a new, it's literally somebody who might need a train fare to get across London. That's where some of the money's gone, is to give candidates a chance to get into the bloody interview in the first place. So it's been nice to think that that's, money that doesn't necessarily make a huge difference to us can make a massive difference to someone else.
Yeah, no, hats off to you, mate. I think it's absolutely
brilliant. Thanks.
You've also, before we move to listener questions, and I've only learnt this, if I'm honest, reading through the research for today's episode, is that Lucky Generals is doing its bits too, and you have something called the Barracks, where you rent a flat near the agency so interns can live in the city without, all that stress and anxiety and worry about paying rent. Is that right?
Yeah, it has. I have to say, it has been somewhat disrupted by lockdown and flexible working, but that is that's how we want to continue sort of going. It's been a bit more sporadic than we would have liked for obvious reasons, but the principle is that accommodation is one of the greatest costs for any young person in London or other big cities around the world, and so I feel like we've got to think more creatively about how we address these problems of representation. And there's no point in, you might find a great candidate and you might, from a diverse background, and you might have a really inclusive culture, but if they literally can't afford to sort of work in the city that you're in, that's not helpful. So, and it's not the only answer. Having offices around the world, or around the country might help. For other people, just being flexible working. We've really embraced that. We've got people in Dublin, and even somebody in Argentina who sort of works for us, just a couple of weeks on, couple of weeks off type sort of thing in the office. So everything's much more possible now to sort of make sure that you've got the widest possible number of people working for you.
Well, I mean, again, hats off to you, because I think it's such a great idea, and I hope it's one that other agencies copy.
Thank you.
I'm going to move to listener questions now, Andy. So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger. But that's not stopped us. And actually, we've got 3 we're going to put to you today. Starting with Alex Bone. So Alex says, what is Andy's favourite brew, Yorkshire tea or Taylor's coffee bag? See, we've nicked that, haven't we, for our quick fire. So we can concentrate on the second part, which is which campaign took longer to brew?
Good question. No, I should preface this by saying that I've got no personal involvement. I can't claim any of the glory. I love both campaigns. But I think Taylor's took a little bit longer to brew, if I'm honest. I think because we won the pitch with Yorkshire tea and got quite quickly to Yorkshire, and they already used the word proper, because they do things proper there. And the twist there was so this is again a good example of just taking something that's sitting right in front of you. We thought rather than talk about them doing things proper, like getting the right tea and the right leaves and quality control and stuff like that, that was a bit boring. So if we showed how they treated everything proper, then from the way they did the interviews to the way that the couriers worked, then the idea was where everything's done proper. And so you just have lots of fun showing, Patrick Stewart doing the leaving speech and Parkinson doing the interviews and all these other great Yorkshire stars doing things properly. And so that was incredibly successful. And it was sort of born out of the pitch. Whereas I think with Taylor's, it took us a long time to work out, coffee and, it's obviously such a crowded marketplace, and what's the Taylor's role in there. But the idea we got to, I love it because it's sort of almost anti-strategic. It was to launch some coffee bags, and we kept on sort of, obviously speaking to the NPD guys, they were saying how incredible these coffee bags are, because it's quite hard to make a coffee bag. It's not as easy as making a tea bag for lots of boring technical reasons. And we kept on trying to sort of understand the boring technical reasons and yada, 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 and think how revolutionary it was. But every time we told the creatives, there was sort of like, yeah, but isn't it just tea bags though with coffee in it? And it was such a sobering, absolute humiliation for the account team, the strategists and the clients. And every time we came back with, no, it's much more complicated. Yeah, but it's just tea bags with coffee in it. And what's taking them so fucking long? They've been, how long have they been in business? What, 100 years? It's like ridiculous. And actually then that became that we thought, yeah, you're right. And so to their great credit, the client, because it's quite self-deprecating, the idea became, why did it take us so long? And then we sort of just acknowledge, yeah, this is a bit dumb. And I think that that's really helpful, because obviously people in the outside world they don't understand the technical challenges of making coffee bags versus tea. So sometimes you're better to, no, they don't give a shit. So you're better to sort of dumb it down and sort of have some fun with it, and not, people. We're all living in our own category so much that we get obsessed by what we do, and nobody really cares. So that was a lot of fun, but it took a little bit longer to brew.
Graham Fraser next. So he says, does Andy have any perspectives on the B2B side? Anyone he thinks is producing great work, or any accounts he thinks he'd enjoy working on? So there's a few there. So any perspectives on B2B?
Well, my perspective generally is, I'm not the first to say this, but B2B, there are some specific differences, but really you got to see it through a human lens, that these are people who are buying, on behalf of a corporation, but they're still human beings. They're either entrepreneurs who's, it's their business and their livelihood, their baby. So that's like super personal to them. But also they're, if not, they're buyers within an organization, and, they're not robots either. It's not like they're only making choices based on price or, rational stuff. Actually, it can be some of the most emotional decisions. The best business to business line ever wasn't an actual slogan, but it was an old adage. Was nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM, and that used to be what American sort of IT procurement people used to say, which sort of speaks to. It's not about the spec, and it's not about, the long list of product features that, everyone could do. It was just that nobody's going to question IBM because the brand is so powerful that, it's about job safety and security, which is a very emotional appeal rather than, wanging on about the product. And, often you find in business that and in B2B, that there's a much better product out there, but that's not enough, because people still in that circumstance buy brands and buy based on emotion. So your job is to have a great product and then find an emotional way of presenting it too.
So the third one might be trickier. Simon Akers, apart from asking why he's such a hero, I mean, there's a queue for the Andy Nairn's fan club, Simon, and I believe Richard Huntington's just in front of me, to be fair. He'd like to know your thoughts on how to apply behaviour change for the new Gamble Aware win, which is a recent win for Lucky Generals, and where his head's at for that generally.
No, it's really interesting, and obviously I can't say exactly what we're doing because it's yet to come out. Obviously, it's also really nice that, having, I said, our first client was Paddy Power, so there's a nice sort of arc of redemption as we come up to our 10th birthday party. And actually, one of the people that we had,
which will be good in the Andy Nairn movie.
Yeah, that's right. He came good in the end. And joking aside, obviously, it is a really serious issue. And the reason we worked with Paddy Power in the first place was it was really because of that Rainbow Laces brief rather than encouraging people a bit. But obviously, it's a huge behavioural issue, not least because a massive proportion of the country in the UK bet, and for a lot of people it's quite a harmless thing. Because obviously, when the Grand National comes, a lot of us, and I include myself, we're literally putting bets on with our kids and getting the newspaper out and sort of teaching them crudely about odds and stuff like that. So people bet, but obviously. There are lots of ways in which individuals can become addicted. It's a health problem and an addiction, and actually the companies in many cases have behaved pretty disgracefully about encouraging that. So, but the real problem from a behavioural thing is, which I guess is the question, is the stigma that surrounds it. Because like I've worked on a lot of behaviour briefs, I'm sure you have too, and lots of your listeners will have too, where at least you've got the goodwill of the population sort of, willing on the good cause that you're addressing, if you know what I mean. You're sort of, if it's an illness, people are, cancer awareness or whatever it is, you're operating in a benign environment. Whereas in the case of gambling, unfortunately, there's a lot of cultural sort of conversation about other people's, it's your fault, you're an idiot, you're a loser, it's a disgrace, you're harming your family. And then that unfortunately makes it very difficult for people to talk about it and to get the help that they need. So I think I'm not giving any secrets away by saying that addressing the stigma really around gambling harms is going to be pretty crucial. So quite tricky, but incredibly fulfilling.
I mean, to use marketing language, I don't think gambling has ever been so mentally or physically available to people, which I think in itself is a massive problem.
Yeah, I think that is it, and that means that in the same way that the industry is using so many more new ways to be within a finger or thumbs click. I think we've got to think quite cleverly. It's going to be really interesting working with the guys at OmniGov on the media placement. How do you get into that environment when people are just about to get themselves into trouble, sort of thing? And how also do you occupy some of the places that the gambling brands are now getting chased out of? That actually opens up little gaps that we can sort of find our way into. But it's incredibly difficult. It's obviously not something that communications can wave a magic wand at, but it is also, and I really absolutely passionately believe this, that comms can play a really powerful role in behavioural change campaigns, and so there's a lot of hope there as well as a lot of challenge.
The final part of the interview then, Andy, is our 4 pertinent poses, starting with number 1. What advice would you give to your younger self?
We've talked about this before in a separate instance, but it would be to not worry about being the loudest person in the room and to try and be the best listener in the room. I think listening's a massively underrated skill. And when you first come into the industry, everyone, for the right reasons, tells you to, speak up and find your voice and don't be quiet. And I was very shy and quiet coming in, and felt a bit out of out of my depth or out of my environment. And look at me now, I'm a egomaniac on a podcast. But no, I think you sort of learn that you sort of learn after a few years that loudness and shoutiness is not the best people. Obviously, can articulate themselves really well, but all the best people I've worked with have been absolutely brilliant listeners. So that would be my advice. Don't beat yourself up if someone's sort of saying you need to be noisier, you need to be less of a wallflower. Don't be so shy and all that kind of sort of stuff.
Yeah, brilliant. And there's a longer piece of advice there, packaged up in a great isolated talks video called Listen Up, which we will link to on this episode too, that Andy kindly donated. Number 2, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
I've thought long and hard about this, and the answer is big tables.
Go on.
So I'm going to have to explain that now. Big tables, because the big tables lead to big meetings where nobody does anything, and it's boring. I hate them, and they're just really not constructive. And and actually, I don't even really mean this just metaphorically. I sort of do a little bit, but physically we have banned big tables. We don't have. We tried one for a meeting very early on, and we felt really unnatural and uncomfortable with it. And it turned into one of those big meetings where it just filled up with people and it was very corporate. And so we got rid of that. I mean, we've never had one since. We've just sit around sofas, and then you have a much more, just like a natural chat about what the problem is, rather than adopt those sort of posing and posturing different people around a big table and a cast of thousands. I'd always much rather have a small meeting with a couple of people who are going to try and do something, rather than 20 or 30 people around the table, of which you probably won't lead to any action. So get rid of big tables. That's my advice.
At what point does a table become big, Andy?
It's a good point.
Or is it relative to the amount of people that are meant to be sat there?
Yeah, it's sort of anything more than half a dozen sort of people. I'm maybe really antisocial. Starts to make me feel a bit twitchy. Yeah, I feel, that if everybody's contributing, then that's a different thing. But it rarely happens that way. There are huge numbers of people sitting at a table just costing money when they could, and probably being bored and not contributing and actually inhibiting. So it's not even that they're not contributing; they're actually making it worse. So I would split it up and go off and do something else instead.
Cool, love it. That's definitely not come up before. Love it even more. Any books that you can recommend to our listeners?
Well, I've always liked Brand Splaining by Jane Cunningham and Philippa Roberts. That's a very good sort of on the role of how brands still talk down to women years after we all thought that they were going to stop doing that, and how we can stop them doing that. And then there's a book by a chap in Ireland called Paul Dervan. Have you read this? It's called Run with Foxes.
Yes, yeah. I met Paul a couple of years ago. He's a lovely bloke.
Oh, did you? He's very, very lovely person, but also I've thought a really wise book from a client perspective, but incredibly creative as well. Just about maybe that's it. Maybe that's it in a nutshell. It's a client perspective on creativity and on brand building. Very, very easily well written, and I sort of whizzed through that. So I would recommend that one.
And then number 4, we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour depending on your view to our guest who has to give their reason why. Would you do the honours?
I would. I've got quite an obscure one because I know you've had 100 of these before. Right, when I was little, there was some sort of crazy old lady sort of moved to our village, and she was called Jane Cowan, and I want to dedicate it to her because she was little beknown to us. She was an amazing cellist, one of the best cellists in the world, and particularly she was a great cello teacher. And she was sort of almost retiring. She was in her late 60s, 70 or something like that. And she inherited this massive house in our village. I'll get to the point in a second, but the point is that she got this huge house, and she opened up this thing called the International Cello School, which is like a ludicrous thing to have outside this village in the middle of nowhere in the Scottish borders. And then she sort of got all the great and the good, like all the best classical musicians in the world to come and learn from her. And us locals, none of us knew who any of these people were. What her proviso was that she would teach them, and also lots of incredible virtuoso students, young people coming up through the ranks. She would teach them only if they also taught the local kids. And so she came into our comprehensive school with these incredible instruments. I mean, like absolute, not the sort of usual school run-of-the-mill instruments. So she was giving out instruments to everyone. She was giving out lessons to everyone from like extraordinary musicians. And I ended up getting a cello from her. And my sister got a flute, and all my mates were getting like double basses and oboes and stuff like that. And so this funny little, very, very average little comprehensive started to, everyone was, I'm not saying that we were world beaters, but it was just a sort of funny world. And we used to go and stay in this big stately home and sleep on the floor in rooms of like 20 or 30 with the teachers in there as well. As someone has since remarked, because someone has written a book about this woman, the safeguarding was not of the standards of, nothing wrong happened, I don't think, but it was sort of the sort of thing you wouldn't do now. Like everyone's just sleeping in one big room with the teachers and for a week at a time. But it was an amazing sort of experience. The reason I sort of, joking aside, sort of say her is what an amazing dedication to creativity. She was in her 70s. She was so enthusiastic about, in her case, music. She had this incredible passion for craft and for the history of classical music, but she also had embraced new ideas. She's always kind of encouraging new ways of playing to sort of come through, and wanting to put something back. And I've just always thought I was glad when I found out that somebody had written a book about her. I think somebody's sold film rights to her as well. Like I really imagine that being an amazing film. And the final sort of epilogue to it is for my 50th. Couple of years ago, my wife, so I'd forgotten all about this person for 30 years or so, and then my wife got me a cello because she's heard me bang on about this person before, and I can't say I'm ever going to be at the Royal Albert Hall anytime soon, but it's given me massive amount. It was in lockdown, and it gave me so much pleasure, and I just sort of thought that lady who died probably 20 years ago, she did make a mark on me, and is a good lesson, good example for all of us in terms of creativity and its power. So this goes out to Jane Cowan.
What a wonderful story. That's absolutely wonderful, Andy. I love that. Well, this episode is so very proudly dedicated to Jane Cowan. As a final call to action, then everyone listening can find links on this episode to Go Luck Yourself, which is Andy's book that I would encourage you to purchase. Listen Up, Andy's isolated talk that we mentioned. We'll link to Run with Foxes and Brands Planing. How else can our listeners get more Andy Nairn?
Oh my God, I'm sure they don't want any more, but that's the main things. I'm on Twitter, obviously, until we all jump ship from that horrendous bin fire that's happening at the moment. Yeah, and I pop up. I'm hard to ignore. Oh, actually, the other thing I want to say is we're just about to launch a pack of cards based on Go Luck Yourself. So, and all the money, all the royalties and profits go to Commercial Break again. So by the time this is out, I think the cards will be out too. So that's another way to enjoy it in a different format.
Fantastic. We'll find a link for that. Or you can send us one if one materialises. But thank you so much, Andy. I've loved chatting. It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise, really, really enjoyed it as ever. Thank you, mate.
And thank you to everyone listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share and review the pod. Keep your questions and guest requests coming in. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online. You can check out CTA Pod on Instagram or email hello@calltoaction.co.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.